Hi, I'm Michael DiSpezio and welcome. In this lesson, we're going to look at viruses and explore their basic structure and their properties. The question that lies at the foundation of this lesson is, how do viruses compare to the cells they infect? But before we look at the lesson content, let's first see what you already know. I'll be presenting a series of statements, and I'd like you to decide whether you think they are true or false. Ready? Okay. First statement. All living organisms are based upon the unit of life called a cell. True or false? Okay, that's an easy one. It's true. Next statement. Cells contain structures that manufacture proteins. And that is also true. All life needs proteins, and the proteins that each cell obtains is made by manufacturing these biochemicals within structures that are already in the cell. And those structures are called protein factories. Scientists call them ribosomes. But just know that these structures within the cell are able to assemble proteins from building blocks that are called amino acids. Okay, next statement. The mitochondria is the control center of the cell. True or false? Well, mitochondria are actually the powerhouses of the cell, so that is false. The mitochondria are the cell parts which produce the energy that's needed to maintain the life processes. And finally, viruses are harmful cells that can cause various illnesses. True or false? And that is false. Yes, viruses can cause various illnesses, but they are not cells. And that is what we're going to look at in this specific lesson. But before we do that, I need you to look at this image. Pretty incredible place, and this is in Singapore. And I'd like you to write a caption for this picture that includes the concept of what you know about living and non-living things. What an interesting place to go. And in fact, if we look at this image, I am seeing both what I would think are actual living trees in the bottom half of the image and structures that seem to resemble trees. Those structures even have branches. But from what I can tell, those structures are not alive, although they certainly appear that they might have a life process to them. Okay, now let's take a deeper look at living and non-living. And we're going to do that by looking at the characteristics of life. All living things share certain characteristics. Those characteristics include the response to stimuli. So they react. If you think about an animal, you can turn on the light. Some animals get attracted to the light, others will run away. Or you might add a drop of chemical to a container that has microorganisms, and some of them will move away or they will respond in different ways. So that's one characteristic of life, the ability to respond to stimuli. Another characteristic is the use of energy. We all use energy, and we use energy to power the processes that keep us alive. If I make a fist or if I use a muscle, that movement requires energy. All living things grow and change. Think about yourself. Think about yourself when you were a small child, a toddler. You've grown a lot since then, and you have also changed. You've developed. So all living things will go through this process of growing and changing or developing. Also, all living things have something called a metabolism. And a metabolism is the sum total of the chemical processes that help you maintain this living condition. Also, living things reproduce, which means they make copies of themselves. Now, this is a little bit different from another word I'm going to mention later called replication. When something replicates, it might not make the copies of itself. It might have something else make copies. A little bit different, and we'll take a deeper look at this later when we discuss viruses. And finally, all living things have what's called cellular organization. What do I mean by that? Well, we've got to look at the basic building block of all life, and that is a cell. Look at all these cells in this image. It's great. And you can see not only the cell bodies that are here, that are in purple, but also the control center. And the control center is falsely colored green in this image. So you can see a photomicrograph, an enlarged picture of numerous cells, and you can also see their control center, the nucleus. Now let's take a closer look at what is a cell. A cell, as I said, is the basic unit of all living things. It doesn't matter whether you're unicellular, like an amoeba or a paramecium or a bacterium, or if you're multicellular, like a cat, a dog, or a person. The basic building block is that cell. Every cell maintains the living condition. So they have to go through all of these processes to maintain what we consider to be life. So they all carry on the life processes. In addition to the organism, which is composed of the cell, also carrying on life processes. All cells have a similar structure and function. Although the parts may not be identical, they carry on similar types of functions, all focused on maintaining that living condition. The structure of each cell has an organization which is based upon something we call cell organelles. And organelles are parts of the cell, and each organelle has its own structure and its function. Let's take a look at that in this drawing, this illustration of a cell. And here you can see a representation of an animal cell. In that central main part, that organelle right there, that orange major organelle is called the nucleus. And you're probably familiar with that. And the nucleus is the cell control center. Well, what do I mean by control center? Basically, the nucleus has the blueprints for making proteins. And proteins are a very important part of all cells. Proteins have both structural and biochemical functions. And these blueprints for making proteins are safeguarded within the control center that's called the nucleus. Another cell part that you're probably familiar with is the mitochondria. And the mitochondria are the cell powerhouses. And these are the parts of the cell that release the energy which is used to power the cell processes and keep it alive. Another part of that cell is the cell membrane. It is the outer living covering of that cell. And that cell membrane controls what goes into the cell and what goes out of the cell. The next cell part is the inner membrane. Actually, there are many different types of inner membranes that are within the cell, and they are similar in composition to that outer cell membrane. And here you can see some of the membranes which are found inside the cell. And if you look closely, you'll notice that on the edges of this inner membrane, you see these red spherical objects, and they are called ribosomes. These are the cell protein factories. So these factories produce the protein. Well, how do they know what protein to make? Remember that cell nucleus contains blueprints for proteins. So a copy of those blueprints travels from the nucleus out through the cytoplasm to these cell protein factories, and these protein factories then assemble the protein that is needed by this cell. Now let's switch gears and look at a virus. Viruses are much more simple than cells. In fact, if we look at viruses, we find that they're made up of really two things. One is a protein shell. And the protein shell, this protective enclosure, is made of building blocks of protein, and these are connected together. And for many viruses, they form a chamber, an inner hollow. What's inside of that inner chamber? The virus blueprints. You may be familiar with substances called nucleic acids, either RNA or DNA. And the virus blueprints contain RNA or are in the form of RNA and DNA, and these are located with inside that protein shell. They're protected there. And like the blueprints that you might have in your cells, these blueprints contain the code for making proteins, for making virus proteins. Now, the virus blueprints are completely enclosed by the shell, and some viruses have even a more complex structure as shown in this illustration here. But you know what's in the inside of that? You got it. The blueprints for making more viruses. So viruses don't have any of those other cell components that I just talked about. So they cannot make their own protein. They count on cells to make their protein. And they do this in a process called replication. I mentioned reproduction before, where a cell makes copies of itself. Well, viruses make more viruses by replication. They hijack a cell's life processes so that the cell then makes more viruses. How does that happen? Well, let's take a look at that. First, a virus invades a cell. And here we have an illustration showing what a virus might look like. And there is a cell. Let's shrink this virus down to size so you can see that viruses are much, much smaller than the cells they would infect. And the first step is for the virus to get inside of that cell. Once the virus infects the cell, then the virus needs to take over the cell. The virus hijacks that cell by releasing its virus blueprints. And the virus blueprints take over those cell protein factories. And suddenly, those protein factories are not making healthy protein to keep the cell alive, but they are redirected to make the components needed to make new viruses. So the next step is the cell begins to create new virus particles. As these new virus particles are made, they are released into the exterior, where these particles can infect new cells. And once they get into the new cells, the whole process of replication repeats. So there you have it, an introduction to the virus structure and to the virus process, which makes new copies of the virus. So in summary, let's examine what we looked at in this lesson. First off, we found that all cells have a similar structure that includes blueprints. Remember those nucleic acids that are maintained inside the nucleus, and also protein factories, cell organelles that scientists called ribosomes. And when the blueprints go from the nucleus to the ribosomes, to those protein factories. The protein factories then assemble the proteins needed by that cell. Viruses are not living. They exist actually at the edge of life, and they are not based upon cells, so they don't have that cellular structure or organization. And they also do not exhibit the characteristics of life. They don't grow. They don't use energy. But remember, what viruses do is replicate. And they replicate by hijacking a cell. So the basic virus structure includes a protective virus shell made of protein and a blueprint for making new viruses. And that blueprint is in the form of a nucleic acid, which could be either DNA or RNA. And viruses replicate by taking over a cell and hijacking those protein factories, so that no longer are they producing protein according to the cell blueprints, but now the virus blueprints have hijacked that mechanism and are causing these cell organelles to make new virus particles. And there you have it for a lesson that introduces you to viruses. I want to thank you for participating, and I'm glad you could attend. If you'd like to find out more about what I am doing in education, please visit my Twitter at DiSpezio, or if you'd like to find out more ideas about science activities, please join us at #HMHScience. Thanks again for joining. I'm Michael DiSpezio, and I'll see you in our next lesson.